Hi everyone, and welcome to my talk, When Game Developers Are Your Customers. This talk is all about middleware, and I'm going to get straight into it because I've got a lot to talk about. So first off, who am I? My name's June. I'm the owner of Redpoint Games. I've been doing game dev for over 10 years now, and the last 4 of that I've been primarily working in Unreal Engine, and I've basically been doing full-time plugin development since mid 2020. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk about, first off, why develop plugins, why build middleware in the first place. And then we're going to have a look at publishing plugins and middleware, pricing, running sales and discounts, and then supporting customers. And that's like half the talk, because it's also probably about half my day. This talk is primarily focused on like code plugins and on the technical side of things. So not so much if you're, selling, textures or models on the marketplace. We're not going to look so much at that. It is kind of focused, and the advice in the talk is focused around code plugins. So first off, why develop plugins in the first place? Well, it might help a bit to have a look at how I got into it, because I didn't actually get into this thinking, oh, I'll, develop middleware full time. I was actually prototyping a game in early 2020 after a pretty bad period of burnout. And while I was kind of, tinkering around with it, I thought, well, this prototype might not go anywhere, but I'm having to write all of these systems. I'm going to have to write the code anyway. I might as well make the code reusable and put it up on the marketplace, and maybe I'll get some return on my investment, right? Because again, the prototype, it might not ever see the light of day, but I'm having to write the code anyway. And now 18 months later, I'm doing it full time. So along the same lines, why might you want to do middleware? Well, again, if you're a game developer and you're having to write, systems or code for these prototype games, it can be a good indication that, like, if you're having to write it for a prototype because you can't find anything out there that does what you need, well, that can be a good indication that the market isn't being served, right? Because you are the market effectively in this case. And so you can basically, the code that you're having to write for this prototype, you can bundle it up into a plugin, and then you can look at publishing it on the marketplace to get some kind of return on your investment. In terms of, identifying, underserved markets, so in terms of like, okay, where can you get a return on your investment, right? If you take the extra effort of writing this code in a way that's reusable, well, you've probably already kind of looked at this, right? When you've been working on this prototype, you're like, oh, I need an inventory system, for example, and you've looked at what's on the marketplace, and you're looking and saying, well, none of the solutions that are there really quite do what I want. That can be a good indication that, as I said before, that the market isn't being served. But you should still sort of kind of do your research in terms of, like, if we look at the inventory example here, right? Well, there's tons of inventory plugins, right? So think about, if you're going to put what you're building on the marketplace, you still need to think about, like, how are you going to differentiate what you're building from the other options that are already there? How are you going to communicate to potential customers? Like, this is the difference between what you've written for your game and what you've written in your inventory plugin and what's currently out there. If you're building something where there isn't really a solution already, so for example, matchmaking, then you don't necessarily have to worry about it so much, because you're not going to be necessarily entering a market that already has a lot of solutions. But it's still important to kind of do your research and think about, okay, where is the actual opportunity if you're having to write this code anyway. You want to think about, like, how easy would it be to find your plugin, right? If you're going to put this on the marketplace, think about, when you're looking for a solution for the problem that you're facing, what are you searching for? What are you trying to, when you go and try and find something that does what you want, what are you looking for in terms of solutions? And to sort of give you an example of, like, where, kind of this really matters. If we look at the Redpoint plugins that don't sell particularly well, so game management framework and replicated sublevel instances, they're fairly niche, and they're fairly, at least in terms of the game management framework, they're fairly abstract, right? So when somebody is searching for something to solve this problem, they're kind of hard to find because of their nature, right? Or in the case of replicated sublevel instances, it's fairly niche. The number of games that are, procedurally generated multiplayer is pretty small, right? In the whole market, right? In contrast, if you look at the plugins that do sell well, so Online Subsystem Blueprints and EOS Online Subsystem, they have very discoverable names, right? If you want to use online subsystems in Blueprints, well, you're pretty much going to search that, right? And this is going to come up because the name is very similar to what you're searching, right? And likewise, if you want to use EOS, well, you're probably going to be searching for EOS, or you're going to be searching for Epic Online Services, and then that product is also going to come up. So think about, in terms of when you're like naming your product, you want to think about like, okay, what am I searching for, so that you can kind of directly associate what you're putting up with the search terms that people are going to be using. So you've written your plugin, you've built your plugin, and now you're at a point where you want to publish it and put it out on the marketplace. So what do you kind of need to do? So if you're like me and you're building plugins that are primarily code plugins, they can be quite hard to visualize, right? So code plugins, they tend to be abstract, and maybe not so much the case if you're making a plugin that generates trees, right? Well, you can probably visualize that by showing pictures of the trees that it can generate. But if you're like me and you're doing stuff that's like networking or really abstract concepts, it's very hard to kind of communicate visually what the plugin offers to people. And so something that I've found works is to use the thumbnails basically as an opportunity to list features, so that when people are looking at the search results, or when they're looking on the marketplace, they can see directly in the thumbnail, oh, it has this feature, right, that I might have a particular need for. So I'll know before I even click through, I know that the product is addressing my needs, right? And then when I click through to the product, you're going to have, up to 25 gallery screenshots, right? And again, you can use this as a way to now kind of go in depth on features, right? So like, for example, for EOS Online Subsystem, you can see the thumbnail lists, authentication as one of the features. The gallery is then an opportunity for me to go in depth about specifically what authentication features it has. And you should be using screenshots from your example project here, which you'll need anyway for documentation purposes and so that people can understand how to use it. So you can use your example project as you can use screenshots of your example project and put that next to the feature lists that you've got in your gallery to kind of demonstrate, okay, this is what those features look like in practice. And if you're doing multiple plugins, right, if you've got multiple plugins on the marketplace, you want to try and develop a consistent visual style across your products, so that people who are searching for your products, whether they're new customers or existing customers, they can associate certain products with you as a developer, right? So that they know, if they've already bought, in this case, EOS Online Subsystem, and then they're looking for, Online Subsystem Blueprints, they have that visual association of from the style that you're using to present the product. You'll also need to get a website up. So you'll need to have a website for your documentation at a minimum. You don't necessarily have to do sort of like a front page thing that like I've done here, but it is a good opportunity to sort of reiterate features and screenshots again, because it helps make the product more discoverable, especially when people are searching outside the marketplace. So if they're searching on Google and that sort of, and yeah, basically like outside the marketplace. Now, if you're a game developer and you're kind of, you're doing your first plugin and you're thinking, well, I don't really want to write all this documentation, right? But there's kind of two ways to look at it. The first one is, if you don't write documentation, then you're not going to get a return on your investment, right? Because people aren't going to understand how to use all the code that you've written, right? Or you're going to get a bunch of refunds because people can't figure it out after their purchase. And at least in the case of the marketplace, Epic will turn around and say, well, you don't have any documentation, so you need to have that. The other way to look at it is if you're writing these systems or writing this code internally inside your team, well, depending on the size of the team, you might have to write documentation anyway for designers and artists to be able to use the system that you've written, right? So it's not that much more of a step to then say, well, I'll just write the documentation in a way that is publicly consumable as well. And when you go to release your plugin or when you do updates, make sure you post your announcements on Twitter, right? This is a really important discoverability channel for you because especially when you're using the hashtags game dev, and in my case, because I'm doing Unreal Engine plugins, using the Unreal Engine hashtag, I tend to see a lot of like interactions coming through those sources, so coming through Twitter via the hashtags. And this is an opportunity to talk about the new features that are in the product. You want to use the screenshots as sort of an opportunity to kind of go through a high-level feature list. But if it's an update, you want to also link to the changelog, which gives a much more in-depth, detailed list of like, okay, here's all the features that were introduced, and here's all of the bugs that were fixed, so that people can click through and see in greater detail. And obviously, you also want to link to the marketplace as well, so that people who see it can click straight through to the page where they can buy it. Before you publish a plugin, you also need to think about pricing. And this is actually very, very important because pricing your plugin is directly going to affect how sustainable it is for you to do this potentially full time. And the approach that I sort of took when I was pricing my plugins originally is what's the cost benefit analysis for game developers, right? As the game developer, yes, like myself or yourself, right? How many hours of development time are you saving someone if they use your plugin, right? And this makes it really easy to kind of start justifying prices that are sort of around, 120 US, which is what I charge for all my products, right? Because you don't have to save a developer too many person hours, right? Before it makes sense to just buy the product, right? For example, EOS, I mean, it's had over a year's worth of development time really gone into it. So at 120 US, if it was to take somebody more than, 2 or 3 hours for a developer on the team to re-implement what I've done, then it makes sense to buy the plugin, right? And then the other side of things is to think about market pressures. So are there any market pressures that require a lower price? Ideally, there aren't, because you've done your market research and you know that there necessarily isn't something that's going to directly compete with you, but it does happen. In the case of EOS, someone else built a plugin for EOS and they were releasing it at the same time as me. So when I was going through the submission process, Epic was like, hey, by the way, there's someone else who's also doing this at the same time. And they'll let you know because they don't want to have plugins whose names conflict too closely. Think about, if that is the case, think about differentiation and communicating the value through the gallery and screenshots. What sets your product apart from the other competing products on the marketplace? So if we look at EOS as an example for a moment, there is a competing product that's priced 20% cheaper, and Epic is releasing a built-in plugin in Unreal Engine 4.27, which that only happened very recently. My plugin's been out since kind of August of last year, so it's been a long time coming. But what are the mitigations here? So the first one is offering a free edition of EOS, which is available to anybody who's earning less than like 30K. So basically targeting that student and hobbyist audience, right? And what I do there is I basically say, well, you don't get any support with the free edition, but it's here and available to use. And that gives a very easy upgrade path to the paid version, right? If you suddenly want support, well, the paid version is entirely compatible, right? You're not having to then suddenly rewrite all your code. Which, contrasting with the other options, right? If you suddenly wanted to go from like Epic's version to the paid version, there is going to be differences there in terms of their implementations. So having a free edition that is highly polished and has plenty of documentation, even though you don't necessarily have support, is intended to mitigate that competition there. And again, communicating feature differences. So in the example on screen, you can see that, the example on the right-hand side doesn't really communicate too many of the features of the product, but it also doesn't really indicate whether or not it supports consoles or iOS. Oh, no, it does have iOS there, but or maybe that's Mac. But it doesn't necessarily communicate that it's support for consoles, right? So if you look at mine, it does specifically say consoles. Yeah, it says at the bottom there, it says mobile, desktop, and console support. So anyone who's looking at these two products who's developing a console can see that EOS Online Subsystem supports consoles, whereas the other product may not. You need to think about the more sales that you do, the more support you're going to have to make. Oh, the more support you're going to have to provide, sorry. This is really critical to think about, because if you price your plugin too low, you're going to get a lot of inexperienced users using it, potentially students and hobbyists, and they're going to be asking for support, and you can potentially going to have lots and lots of users, and you're not necessarily going to be able to provide a very good support experience if you're just getting overwhelmed with support requests. On the other hand, if you price your plugin too high, you might not make any sales, but you also won't have to do any support for the product because you won't necessarily have made any sales, and you can always lower the price later. So it's really indicative that you should kind of start out high, and then depending on what the market looks like, you can then lower the price later. You also want to think about the impact of monthly sales. So this is something that I wasn't super aware of when I first listed my plugins on the marketplace, but they basically run sales every month, and they typically want discounts of 30, 50, or 70% off assets. If you're going to participate in these sales, you need to take that into account when pricing your product, right? Because where the Redpoint plugins are sort of priced is it doesn't really let me go any more than like 30% at best, because anything that's a steeper discount than that is just simply too much of a discount in terms of valuing the product, or getting or basically having enough excuse me for a second. In terms of like, if somebody's only paying a very small amount, well, then you have to think about, like, if I have to support them, how much time can I spend supporting them before I'm no longer breaking even in terms of my time being used to support this individual. So that's kind of the issue that you run into with potentially high discounts. So just to kind of reiterate my advice on pricing, you kind of want to aim for like a minimum 100, 120 US. This is sort of kind of like, if you're a professional game developer, this is not really that much money for the value that a plugin is providing. You don't want to price it at like $5. You're going to get lots and lots of customers, and you're going to have a high support load, and you're not going to be able to justify providing really high quality support, because each customer is not necessarily worth that much of your time if you're looking at it purely on a cost basis, right? Of how much time, what's your hourly rate effectively, what's your time worth, right? It becomes very difficult to support when you're pricing at kind of like $5. Start high and then lower over time if you need to, because yeah, you don't want to run into a situation where you've got lots and lots and lots of support cases, but not the sales revenue to justify it. And as a side note, plan for your income to vary in different months. It's not quite like a consumer market, which I will get into the sales data in just a moment, but there is still some variation. So for example, for Redpoint, it varies between about $3,000 and 6,500 are kind of like the extreme endpoints each month, and the average kind of sits around about 4,700. So you do sort of have to take that into account. So speaking of sales, right? Speaking of those monthly sales, what does the sales and what does the market actually look like? Well, as I said, it doesn't really follow kind of the same pattern of sales that you'll see in games, right? Your audience is game developers, not consumers, and the decisions that they're using to make the decision making process that they're using as to whether or not they're going to buy your product is very different. For games, it's often going to be an emotional connection, right? But for game developers, it's going to come from a practical need for the product. And because of that, the sales pattern is quite different, and the strategies for making sales is quite different as well. The advice in this section is going to be specific to the Unreal Engine marketplace. Your mileage may vary with other distribution mechanisms or other engines. So what have I found that works and what have I found that doesn't work, right? So I found that the marketplace showcase, this is basically where Epic puts you on the front page of the marketplace, that seems to work fairly well. I did a 10% discount, and with the extra visibility, that seemed to result in a net increase in revenue. The other thing that seems to work is cross-promoting from other discounted products. So this is a case where I would put game management framework, which, or as I mentioned earlier in the talk, doesn't sell a whole lot of units. I put that at 50%, and then I would see a bump in sales on EOS Online Subsystem, for example. What doesn't work, or what maybe works, is the monthly sales participation for the main product. So this is like where I'm discounting EOS Online Subsystem, for example. What I found with this is that it tends to kind of skew when you make sales towards the end of promotion. And at least at the 30% discount, I saw more sales, but only about 30% more sales, right? And so if you look at it, you can look at that and say, well, okay, that's a break even, right? Because, each sale is worth 30% less, but you're making 30% more, so your net revenue is the same. But you have to take into account that it's also 30% more customers, right? Which means a higher amount of support. So it's actually not worth it on that basis to do a 30% discount, because the net revenue is the same, but your support load has increased. Some people have said that 50% works better, but as I mentioned earlier, I don't super want to do that, because I don't necessarily want people to value my products at that kind of level. And obviously you have the support load costs as well, right? The support load costs in terms of what's the revenue per customer that you potentially have to support. So if we dive into a bit of sales data, this is a sales data for EOS Online Subsystem. We can see that the average sales, which is the orange line on the graph, tends to be about 0.6 to 1 sale per day, right? And it's fairly consistent over time. Obviously, there are dips there, but that's actually aligning with different prices for when discounts are running. And so this kind of is this is quite substantially different from what you'll see in like games with the consumer audience, where you're going to have these big spikes that correlate with like launch sales or launch discounts and other, like, for example, Steam summer sale. And then you're going to see very minimal sales in other periods of time. With plugins on the marketplace, at least, it's fairly consistent, even though it does kind of vary a little bit, but you don't get these huge spikes and troughs. So the showcase sale that I mentioned earlier, that 10%, you can see that kind of did give a decent boost in sales. It kind of goes up to an average of 2 sales right in the middle of that showcase period over a longer period. So that's worth it. But if we look at the 30% sale discount, we can see spikes. It actually goes off the Y chart there. It goes up to about 7 unit sales at its peak. But as I mentioned earlier, the overall revenue is the same. And if we look at some of the other periods in the graph, so this period here is when Game Management Framework was 50% off. So this is talking about the benefits of doing that kind of discounting one product, and you'll see a boost in other products. Even though Game Management Framework did not really sell at all in that period. So just the extra visibility of somebody seeing Game Management Framework discounted, because it's going to come up in a different area of the store, clicking through and seeing what other products that we have, basically. And the only other bump to really kind of look into here is the one that happens right in January. And the best analysis I've kind of figured out for this one is that it's right after the Christmas break. So it's game developers who are returning to work after the Christmas holidays. And you can see that the Christmas period is lower as well. If you look at the orange line, you can see that the average dips in kind of late December-ish. And a few more notes. If you're looking at your sales data, the sales you sell, like the units you sell per day, it's very, very random, very stochastic. It's very hard to sort of draw a direct correlation from like, oh, I did this thing and then, you know, I made 10 sales the day after. It doesn't really work like that. It can be very, very noisy. And the thing is, the marketplace doesn't give you particularly good tools for like analyzing where your sales come from. All you get is just like, this is how many sales you made per day. You don't get referrers. You can't see where your traffic's coming from or anything like that. And the other thing is some plugins won't sell. This is kind of normal. So as I mentioned earlier, Game Management Framework and replicated sublevel instances, they don't sell a ton of units. This is because they're either niche or kind of hard to discover. But at the end of the day, less sales means less support. So what I found is I can basically just leave them up for the few customers that do have a need for them. And that's fine because they don't have a huge support load in comparison to the other products. So you've published your plugins now. You've got customers. Now what? Well, now you've got to support people. So let's have a talk about that. So first off, email sucks. Email-based ticketing sucks. It's bad for you and it's bad for the customer. It takes a long time to get responses. And it's very easy to lose track of things because it just sucks. You want to use something like Discord because first of all, it means you can respond to customers quickly and they can respond back quickly. And when you're trying to diagnose like a bug report or a crash, it's very useful to be able to say, okay, can you grab me these logs, or can you try and attach the debugger here? And you can have a much more interactive session with the customer trying to get to the root cause of the problem, right? The other thing is make the Discord channels public, because this makes it easy for customers to help each other, right? And find past solutions to problems that they have, right? Because they can use the search inside Discord. This is also very useful because, at least for me, I'm a sole trader. There's only one of me. Practically, I can't be online all the time. So there are cases where a customer will ask a question. It'll be like 1 a.m. in the morning for me, where, obviously I'm not online. And another customer will be like, oh, it's this solution, or here's the docs that show you how to do that, or this is the bug report, or this is the issue in the issue tracker that's tracking that bug. And so that's really beneficial as well, and something that you don't really get if you're doing email-based support. If you're using Discord, don't use direct messages. I did this early on. I had the ability for people to kind of direct message me for like private tickets and stuff, but it just gets really messy. You want to keep everything in the server as much as possible. It gets messy because, if a customer has multiple points of contact, if they've got multiple employees, it can be very hard because then you're having to relay between two different people the conversations that you've had. I recommend that you turn off allowing direct messages from server members in your server. So you can do that from like the privacy settings in Discord, because that will stop people trying to DM you. And the other thing is, make sure you have a different Discord account for work than for your personal account. This is really important and something I hadn't done until probably, I want to say about 4 or 5 months ago, and it just makes an enormous difference in being able to maintain a work-life balance and switching off outside work hours, because at least for Discord, it does tend to be a platform that is, kind of a social platform that isn't necessarily work orientated. So keeping two separate accounts, one for work and one for personal, is just a really, really good idea. You want to design your software to just work, right? So here's the thing, right? You want to kind of you're trying to reduce as much of the support burden as possible, right? So you don't want customers to have to perform configuration to get started with the software. You kind of want it to just work out of the box with zero configuration. And you can't really expect people to have read the documentation before they start trying to get it working. They're going to install it through the launcher and they're going to try and start using it straight away. And if it doesn't work straight away, that can be a cause of people coming to your support channel and being like, it doesn't work. How do I get it working? So if there are cases where like someone needs to read the documentation in order to go through a setup process, you kind of do need to kind of point them in that direction from within the software so that you don't have the support question in the first place, right? And to give you an example of like designing software to just work, EOS Online subsystem, it could just give you a generic login function to log into the backend, right? And leave the burden on the customer to kind of get the credential from whatever platform they're running on. But this is really complex and really error prone and sucks. And I know because I've had to implement that logic. So instead, the plugin just has a whole feature around making this process automatic, right? So that from the customer perspective, all you have to do is call auto login and then the plugin does all the hard work, right? And so then I don't have to do the really hard, like supporting people trying to like integrate this thing into whatever platform they're using, because they can just call auto login and it'll do the job for them. Documentation is really, really essential. And you should write your documentation when you're writing new features, right? It's much, much easier to do this than to say, oh, well, I'll document it later. Because if you say you'll document it later, it'll get on the backlog in your issue tracker and it will not get done. And I know this because I have docs for features that were like 8 months ago and I still haven't had a chance to come back and sit down and write the documentation for them. So it's really important that you write the documentation when you're writing the features. And if you're writing the documentation when you're implementing the features, it also means that when you release the update, customers who are trying to use the new features, the documentation is already there and ready to go. You want to document in different forms as well, because everyone learns in different ways. You absolutely need to have like reference documentation and how-to guides, and you need to have example projects, right? My strategy for the example projects is I basically have like an internal version of the example project that I use for my daily development. So when I'm implementing new features and stuff, I'm actually implementing it in the internal version of the example project. And then when I release a new version of the plugin, I basically make a public version from that private project, right? And then it means that I don't have this whole step of like, oh, I'm implementing these features and wait, now that I'm ready to do the release, I have to go back and put it all in the example project, right? Because I've already put it in the example project during the development process, right? Video tutorials. This is kind of tricky because they take a long time to do. And when they get out of date, your only option is to basically re-record them. I have had some customers in the past that are like really dead set on video tutorials. And so there is a few video tutorials for EOS Online subsystem, but I don't really look at it for newer products because they have such a high cost in terms of like developing them and then maintaining them in comparison to text documentation, which obviously you can just update the middle of a document in the text documentation or in the how-to guide, right, when something slightly changes compared with a video tutorial that you have to completely re-record. You want to maintain a changelog for new releases so that customers can quickly find out what's in each new release that you're doing. And this is also going to help you later when you have to figure out like, okay, I'm fairly sure that I fixed that bug, but what version was it fixed in, right? it's really useful for that as well, because it makes it easier for you to find it, makes it easier for the customers to find that as well. And as I mentioned earlier, you want to link to the changelog in any announcements you do, like on Twitter, so that people can directly see, like they can directly go to the changelog and be like, oh, okay, for this release, these are all the changes. And you can always write better and more comprehensive documentation. It's almost always a good use of your time. Excuse me. You want to learn from your support requests. So when you get a support request from a customer, whether that's how do I do X or this feature doesn't seem to work, right? You want to, first of all, you want to answer the question and address the customer's issue first, right? But then you should look at how can you avoid getting that question again, right? Can you improve your documentation to avoid getting the how-to question? Or can you improve your automated tests so that bugs don't get in, right? So you should take each support request as a learning opportunity and a way to improve your product so that you don't have, you don't just keep getting the same questions again and again and again. And this feeds in a lot to scaling support, right? Because when you're selling plugins, right, or when you're selling middleware that's a one-off sale, right, you're gonna reach a point where you have a lot of customers who have bought the software in the past, right? And as one person, it becomes kind of difficult to support that, right? It's very easy to think about it if you don't think of it in terms of like the mathematics of it, right? You're making a once-off sale, but you potentially have to support customers forever. And so this is why it's really important to try and improve your documentation, improve your processes so that you can reduce the support load over time. But even still, at some point, you're going to have enough customers that even those strategies don't necessarily mitigate all the support questions or mitigate the support load. And so you'll need to start looking at things like creating a premium support tier. And so basically what I've done at Redpoint is we have a standard support tier, which gets included with a customer's purchase. And that has a best effort SLA, which means we'll get to the questions when we can, right? If we get lots of questions on a particular day, or if we have other priorities, or we're backlogged, then basically requests will queue up, right? We will get to them when we can. And for standard support, you also want to drive people towards public support forums where everyone can benefit. We don't actually have a private ticketing for standard support because it's really important to let those customers kind of assist each other where possible, right? And then on the other side, we have premium support. And this is sort of the support that we tailor towards like larger studios and larger indies. And it's a recurring revenue model. So you pay a certain amount per month per developer seat. And this allows you to have support that's much more sustainable long-term for the customers that are paying for premium support. And it also means that you can provide them some guarantees around like SLAs, so they'll get a next business day response time, right? It puts you in a position with enough people on premium support that you can look at hiring people and hiring additional staff to do support. And in terms of, you want to tailor this to what your customers are asking for. In the case of Redpoint, we provide, prioritized bug fixes, private tickets. If you've got, a game and you really don't want to be discussing the details of that in the public channel, then you can discuss it with us privately. And so you really kind of want to tailor whatever you're doing in this space. You want to tailor it to what your customers' needs are. And they'll tell you basically, and you should ask them and you say, okay, well, what, we're introducing premium support. This is what we think is a reasonable feature set to provide at this price, and engage with your customers to find out what they want. You also want to build tools to automate repetitive tasks. So in our case, I built an online license manager tool, which helps automate a bunch of common stuff like receipt processing for customer entitlements to see, for example, have you purchased EOS Online Subsystem, or are you using the free edition? Because the free edition doesn't come with any support, so I need a way of processing receipts and making sure people are entitled to support before they can post in the Discord. Managing customer console access. If your plugin has specific console access that you need to manage, it's fairly rare if you're doing that sort of stuff, but at least for EOS, we have to do that because of the way EOS integrates on each platform. Tracking support subscriptions, and keeping Discord roles in sync, so who has access to what channels. If you're doing something repetitive that is not kind of like the core business of like writing the plugin code or doing support directly, see if you can write a tool to do it for you, because that will also save you time. Communication with customers is really key, and you need to be transparent with customers as well. Because if customers are coming to you with a support request, ultimately, like, that's on you, right? It's not really their fault that they've run into a problem, because it's really a case of like either the bug is in the software that you've written, or your documentation isn't good enough to to let them figure out how to use it, right? But you also need to kind of know the boundaries. If a customer isn't really working with you to solve requests, then you need to communicate with the customer that you're blocked on receiving info from them, right? If you need them to send through logs before you can solve a problem, then you have to be clear with them and say, okay, well, I need X from you, right? And if you're not getting anywhere, if the customer doesn't kind of respond and want to provide you with those things, you just have to be clear with them and say, well, like, sorry, but unless you give me more information, I can't really help you. You also need to be clear with customers about your availability, especially if you're like me and you're a sole trader and there's only one of me, for example. You need to make sure people are aware of the time zone that you're in, right? So, for example, I'm based out of Australia. So for a lot of my customers, right, when it's their Friday, it's my Saturday, right? And when it's Monday for me, it's Sunday for them, right? So communicating to them, hey, by the way, it's Saturday here, I'm not actually online, is really important, so that customers don't go into the support channel and be like, why is no one answering? It's a Friday, there should be people there. As I've mentioned throughout this talk, make sure you maintain a work-life balance, because if you're burnt out or if you're overworked, you aren't going to be able to provide good support for your customers, right? It's basically bad for everyone if you get burnt out. And another tip that I have is I have my Discord status always set to offline, and that particularly helps with preventing like my anxiety around feeling obligated to answer questions outside of work just because I am technically online, right? By having my status always offline, I don't feel that pressure. Take time off when you need it. Ultimately, if you're self-employed, this is one of the perks, and you know better than anyone when you're starting to need a break, so take one. But be clear and communicate with customers about your availability. If you're like, I'm taking these days off because I need to, be direct and be upfront and just tell customers, like, okay, I'm not going to be available for these days, because that helps make sure that the right expectations are around when you're going to be responding to questions. And these strategies work. Especially around like support, it quite literally pays to give your customers excellent support. We don't have any review that is not 5 stars on the marketplace. And if you go and read them, you'll find again and again, customers say that the support is great. And that's it from me. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the GCAP chat, or you can message me on Twitter at HQ on Twitter. And also yeah, follow Redpoint Games on Twitter as well. Website's there. Or you can join our social or developer support discords. As of recording, we do have some contract work open, so if you're interested in that, check out the jobs page that's listed there. And thank you very much, and thanks for coming to my talk. Bye.